Hello, my name is Michael Ray, and I'm the director of the American Indian Program here at New Mexico State University. We thank you for joining us once again as we continue our series on our digital platform. As we all wish we can come together, we look forward to doing it again soon. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we wish you a good day.
Thank you,
Okay.
computer.
So, as I mentioned before, my name is Michael Ray. I'm the director of the American Indian Program, and we're going to be introducing our guest this evening, Dr. Lee Francis IV. As I get to say, Lee is one of those guys that, when we saw each other a very long time ago at NMSU Grants, it was like, yes, somebody else that speaks with their hands and has a lot of emotions, you know. So it's one of those awesome times that we've been able to see each other very back far then and still continuing to some of the events and endeavors that we're doing nowadays. So with that, he can probably introduce himself a lot better than I can introduce him, as much as of a hype man that I can be. Dr. Lee Francis IV.
Michael, thank you so much. Gwati hapa, tawacha washrap, wahindome Lee Francis, washesh kawekame, eve medicaname, washesh hapani washchi. Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Lee Francis, my family's from the Pueblo of Laguna, from the village of Huari, Huichi, and we call it home. My clan is Little Oak from my dad's side, up through my grandma, which is where she comes from, and my mom, Americana, from as I'd like to say, the Pueblo of Missouri. So she's all, so I got that mixed type of thing. I am the executive director for WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. I am the founder of the Indigenous Comic-Con. I am the owner and proprietor for Red Planet Books and Comics. And what else do we do? Native Realities Publishing. So, my work and my role really, and I think why Michael and I are connected and how I've been connected with NMSU for a number of years, going back, really began, out of education. I actually started in my 20s teaching at Laguna Acoma High School. I was there for a number of years. I was there for about 10 years, working with students through various realms, starting from the high school side, then moving to after school programming, then moving into higher education and doing higher education transition work. And then my kiddo was born, and I moved back into Albuquerque to be closer to him. I worked at NACA for a while, and then pursued my PhD in education, educational leadership, and school improvement at the University of or at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, which I did in 2015 or 2014. I was trying to think about that. So as I see my giant face on here, forgive my quarantine beard. We're all kind of growing it out these days. Because that's what, at least I'm wearing pants. That's all I'm saying. At least I'm wearing pants. So, thanks for showing up. I'm going to talk a little bit today. I got a PowerPoint that I'll sling for you. And I know we're kind of all like zoomed a little bit. So it's going to be a little bit of storytelling. And I'm just going to kind of go through really the ways in which, a reframing of the ways in which we look at natives in pop culture. And I want to start this, and it's going to be a touch controversial. And I want to make sure that I'm very clear when I kind of move into this in the ways that our communities as Native folks have been, affected by colonization and what has happened with that, and how colonization doesn't happen independently. It's not just, people invading and storming. That's just a whole bunch of killing. We know that happened historically with our folks as well, right? Like, tribes, assumed each other, and people stole each other, and people moved in different places. We know that took place historically. But colonization in of itself is much more targeted, direct, and insidious, because it's not just that imperialism. It's not just a conquering of a people. It's a conquering and then a subsuming of the various aspects of the soul. And it's various aspects of the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul. So all of those things come together. And so that's what I have looked at for a number of years, especially coming back from my education background, that it was really where it came into play was because I started looking at what my students in the classroom had in terms of what they could read and what represented them, and there was so very little that I saw. There was like a couple of like native written kids books, some picture books, a lot of picture books written by non-native folks. And then there was this sort of huge gap of like, there was not a lot of middle grade readership. And then it just jumped right into adult Native literature, right? So that's like Louise Erdrich, Scott Momaday. I mean, that's a huge leap. And so there wasn't a lot in this middle ground where you really begin to develop literate readers and people that really enjoy reading, because that's a big component. I love reading. I enjoy reading. I enjoy, literature and science fiction, all the rest of that. And when I began to evaluate it, I recognized that big gap was really around the graphic medium, comic books, and sort of that pop culture, where our superheroes are, because that was so influential for me when I was in my middle school years, right? To have these superheroes that didn't necessarily look like me, but just having superheroes, right? Like that was really great. I loved Iron Man and Spider-Man, and I remember playing and Dungeons and Dragons where I could be the character. So like all of that sort of nerd stuff, right? So, in terms of looking at that, what I really set out to do was from the academic side, was to analyze and evaluate where, Native folks exist and have existed since colonization, since first contact within the pop culture realm. Because I think it's really critical and important that we understand that, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, because colonization is very targeted. And it's not about just the conquering aspect. It's how do you keep a people conquered and colonized, and especially through what I say is pop culture propaganda and the media. So I'm gonna go through that here in a second, but I want you all just to kind of think for a second. I just read yesterday, and I'm working on an article right now that I'm gonna post on Medium. And again, it's linkbaity, so I just want you all to be aware. It's very clickbaity, but it's white folks like dead Indians, right? Especially in this time of COVID-19, the articles that are coming out right now are really highlighting the tragedy of Native existence. Now, we know our people are really struggling and suffering under this. We know that the highest rates are in Navajo Nation. And that's what I said. I don't want to dismiss our people and doing this, but pop culture for Native identity really likes to focus on the suffering aspect and the tragedy of Native existence. Because I actually put a call out a couple of days ago where I was asking, I said, hey, my other Native communities, where are we succeeding, right? Because we don't have a balance in terms of where we're succeeding, where our folks shut down their borders like right away, right? Where they were taking care of their grandparents. Those are not the articles that are making it into the New York Times, right? Yet as a counterpoint, we know that we've been focusing here with all the C-19 stuff, and we can see, America doing this, but there's always a counterpoint to say like Sweden's doing better, North Korea's doing better, right? Except when it comes to Native communities, we don't get that. Same thing applies when we had the Keystone, the No DAPL stuff and the pipeline. What are the first images that come to your head? They were Native folks on horseback staring down tanks, right? It wasn't Native people doing the day-to-day stuff. It wasn't pictures of grandmas. We saw that on our social media. I had bunches of friends up there that were posting the fact that it's like cleaning the bathrooms today. I was like, because that's what you do when you are at camp, when you're at sheep camp. That's what you do when you're, protesting and occupying. There's a lot of the smaller things that need to get done, the mechanics that need to get done. But that's not what the media tends to focus on. What the media looks at, and I don't like to use that term as much, but we'll say it's the Western media as opposed to, like our own media, is that it focuses on the notions of Native identity and Native existence that have been perpetuated for 400 years. So when we see articles in the New York Times talking about, the tragedy of Native existence, I look at it and say, like, you know what? Everybody's struggling right now. Rural communities are going to be hit. Our own communities are going to be hit. What you're doing is continuing to reinforce a dynamic when you don't provide the other side of showing how awesome and how Santa Clara Pueblo has been, their response has been fantastic, how Eastern Cherokee's response has been fantastic, how, the couple of the folks out in the California tribes, their response to all this has been fantastic. They've been taking care of their people. And again, let me make sure I have an asterisk. That's not to say that Navajo Nation is not taking care of their people. It is the effects of poor healthcare, lack of resources, etc. So I don't want this to become a soundbite and somebody posts on Twitter being like, that Dr. Francis says Navajo South. No, That's not what I'm saying. But I do have to analyze and investigate the ways in which Native folks, because that's my research, is the ways in which Native folks have been perceived and represented throughout the American time frame, right? So that's the premise. Now, I'm going to showcase, I think I've got the access so that I can share my screen. I'm going to go through some of these slides, and I'll kind of back and forth a little bit. You know, and kind of show you how this works historically, because again, it's not something that that has started, you know, recently. It didn't start with cinema. The ways in which Native people have been represented throughout history began back 400 plus years ago. In the mid 1600s, you know, these early representations, Columbus's diaries, etc. So let me switch this over. Thank you for that. I will share my screen and you can see all of my notes on the side. So there you go. Hi, everybody. Here we go. I think that's, can you see everybody's got the slide? Thumbs up. Yeah, we can see that on the front. Perfect. It's sad because I'm like, I feel like I try to be a you know, a technophile. Like I was like, I know technology, but then I was just like, is this actually working? I don't know anymore. I feel like a dad these days. Anyway. So it's really Native Americans in pop culture, and I call it the invisible struggle, because it's the underlying struggle and the dynamics of what propaganda does. So not only do we have the visible struggle, which is, you know, the issues that we face on the reservation, the tangible things about, you know, what has happened in subjugation, you know, but then this invisible struggle is then how we continue to be perceived and how much we internalize a lot of the representations, how much that becomes the ways in which we reflect on ourselves, right? So I always like to start off with that. There's one of our, you know, superhero, Frybird Power opens it up. I was just like Frybird Power. Thomas builds the fire, smoke signals. I usually do this. So sometimes when I do this presentation for young people, it's always funny. I was like, does anyone remember, does anyone know this image? And it's really funny because like about half the Native kids will, but none of the non-natives know this anymore. So it's really fun. I was just like, and none of y'all seen no movies. So smoke signals, you know, great setup. I like to open this up, you know, just as a talking point. So really what we look at in terms of Native representations is we look at these three particular areas: identity, authenticity, and erasure. And so what we're talking about in terms of identity is, you know, who is telling the story? And authenticity is how are they telling the story? And erasure is who is left out of the story. Right? And so this trinity really is what defines the ways in which we look at how Native people have been represented, because for let's say for about 320 years out of that 400, we didn't represent ourselves. Other people represented us. Because we were too busy trying to fight for our lives, trying to survive. We weren't able to, say, control the media. We didn't have our own printing presses until later on. We didn't have that access in terms of being able to do a widespread distribution of our own identity. And by that point, a lot of this stuff becomes cemented, and even in the ways in which we have to push back against those types of representations. So when we talk about identity, right? So who tells the story? The identity of the original person. Is it a native? Is it non-native? Is it me as a Pueblo guy writing about other natives, right? There's all sorts of these complexities that go into how we're telling our stories, who is telling our stories. The authenticity is then how are the stories being told? Are they being told in a way that honors, you know, that's, you know, maybe respectful, or that adds the nuances in terms of the literature? And I know you guys have checked this out, because you can tell the difference almost immediately between like a native writer and a non-native writer just by looking at the back of the book, right? My kid, you know, got this assignment to read Thunder Rolling in the Mountains, which is written by Scott Odell, non-native guy. I think his claim to fame was Island of the Blue Dolphins, if you all remember that from back in the day. Non-native writer. He wrote a book about the Nez Perce and their whole, you know, and, you know, Chief Joseph and their persecution and, you know, and what happened with them. But just the back of the book, like reading through this was so difficult for me to read that I actually had to shut it down. I was like, kid, you ain't reading this book, you know? And I was like, and we ain't in school right now, so you ain't gonna get punished, so everything's good. This was like, you know, the daughter of Chief Joseph, and I mean, just the way in which they framed it is so romanticized. And there's the daughter of Chief Joseph, and she wants to fight, but she knows she has to take care of her people and she has to stay home. And I was like, not only is it like just stereotypical, it's also kind of sexist, right? So this way, and I'll talk about a little bit, you'll see here in a second about the ways in which that comes together, but that authenticity, because then you can take that parallel what I had my kiddo read, which was How I Became a Ghost by Tim Tingle, which talks about the Cherokee Trail of Tears, or the Choctaw Trail of Tears. And so how that happened, and the story, that takes place with that. And there is such a different dynamic that exists when we begin to look at the ways that authenticity, the ways in which the nuances begin to emerge, and the ways that we push back as Native writers and storytellers and Native creatives against this particular narrative that's developed. And the last part is the erasure. And the erasure becomes really important when we think about just what happened with, like, the Land O'Lakes, Mia, the Butter Maiden, right? And if you, are aware that they took it off of Land O'Lakes, there was a, campaign. It was the one that everybody knows was, created by Patrick Desjardins, who was Ojibwe. And, so now we're getting to the spaces like, okay, at the time when he created this, there's a pushback now, and we can say that definitely our tastes have changed. Definitely there's much more awareness. Definitely there's much more of intent versus impact, and how that works. But the time when he created that character, he was a working artist. There's other examples of his art that are completely different than that. And also for him, it was trying to get Native people back into the media, right? Because, Western culture had done a really good job of erasing. And so when we think about who is not in those stories, and how Native people do not exist in a number of these spaces, that's the triumvirate, that's the trinity. So identity, authenticity, and erasure. So we go back 400 years, the earliest representations of Native people, this is categorized as the noble savage. Here is our noble savage. The earliest, what am I thinking? the earliest reference to this particular character using the term noble savage came from John Dryden in the mid-1600s in his play called The Conquest of Granada. And what it did was it set out the archetype for how the noble savage would be the parallel or the counterpoint to the English characters in this space. And the noble savage being the one that, here they are, they're, the English always established nobility, so that way they could do treaties and etc. So they had to establish a nobility. And so the English establishing this nobility here, but also the savagery, right? The romanticized, the Gothic era, the romanticized notion of the Americas. And so when we see this come in, we see this early in the Columbus diaries, and then we see these linotypes, these artistic interpretations of the noble savage begin to develop. And it's always as this counterpoint. The English, the lazy English rapscallion, possibly the hero, but it's the hero's journey, doesn't know he's the hero yet. It's like, look, you terrible English guy, the noble savage acts better than you do. You should act like him, right? So it was always used as this counterpoint. So Native folks is an object, not an identity, but not a true representation of Native identity, but one that was always in counterpoint to English, French, American, so colonial identity, right? And as you can see in some of the spaces, you see some of the representational images that we deal with today. First and foremost, you have the headdress on the top, right? So colorful headdress that moves into a particular space. Not to say our folks didn't wear headdresses, not to say that they didn't, but it becomes the archetype. So when we think about how the archetypes are established 4 centuries ago, if you think about Pueblo folks, we don't do that. Our Navajo religion, they don't do that. California folks have a whole different concept of the way that works. So, but it establishes it very early on. You also see some of the other things. I love the parrot on the finger, right? So this, this identity with nature, and how, this sort of naturalized existence. Here's a parrot on my finger, and I can talk to animals. And you see this a lot moving forward, like I'm going to throw a spirit wolf into battle, or I'm going to have, the birds flock around me because I'm so into nature, right? So this is an archetype that's established. Something that the kids point out is the tattoos. So whether, historically, traditional, representational, a lot of what happens is we see that more as not a historic representation, although we can gain some history from that. We see it as a savage representation because the English didn't tattoo themselves. So we have to show the tattoos. So that way we know that this particular character, the noble savage, is, you know, somebody that like is, you know, so they scar up their bodies, even though we know that there's traditional value to that. There's beliefs, there's spirituality, there's things that go into that from our ancestors and the ways that we work that did not come out in this type of interpretation. You can also see the, I'm just going to say my favorite part is like, this dude is ripped, definitely not wearing pants. So he is just digging in on the quarantine time. That's all I'm saying, right? Always a loincloth, but I mean, it's a six-pack. I make the jokes to the kids. I was like, I've never looked like this in my life, even when I was a student athlete. I've always been, you know, I'm like a tall Pueblo, but I've always been like what my dad said. I'm just, you know, round and brown. So that's how it works in our household. These guys always look like this. Now, there's been some interesting conversations because I always like this interpretation of it, and I like to make the joke about it. But we can talk about the fact that our folks prior to colonization and prior to commodity food and food deserts and all the rest, you know, had a much leaner physique, as did most people at the time, right? So, you know, this sort of like physicality. However, there again, in most of these representations, there is a historical precedence, but the way that it's used to be represented in terms of popular media, in terms of the propaganda, it's used to highlight masculinity. It's not used to highlight the historical, this is not a historical objective representation. It is to showcase that the noble savage is more masculine than masculine. And the reason why is because when you start to dive in to somebody that's going to colonize and somebody that's going to conquer, you're going to conquer all the small chubby ones? You're going to conquer all the skinny ones? No, you want the biggest, baddest dude, and you want to show that you beat the biggest, baddest dude. And so you have to do that in your media. The last part that always gets me is the bow and arrow, which has been so identified with Native folks. Obviously, a long-range weapon. It's very interesting because we don't showcase the English longbow, which is one of the most, you know, powerful and formidable weapons for hundreds of years. We'll always identify the Native folks with it. Native folks throughout history and true historical representations, when they got their hands on actual armed weaponry, guns themselves, they were deadly, they were accurate, and they were amazing. Problem is we didn't control the means of production. So at a certain point, we just didn't have the resources, the bullets, right, to be able to continue to use that. However, whenever it's represented with the noble savage, it's always like, I will use my trusty bow. I will not use the white man's devil weapon, right? And that's when we start to get into the problem. And in terms of these representations, it's not that we didn't use bow and arrow. It's not that we didn't have this, but it's the only go-to that we see. You never see the accurate representations of war clubs or knives or hatchets or various arrows. You see some tomahawks because I think people like the name, you know, but you don't see a lot of the actual representations. And there are so many incredible historical representations. Native folks as, you know, squadron commanders with rifles and et cetera. So this is one of my biggest pet peeves because this is always the default. Whenever we think about the noble savage, they always go back to using the bow and arrow. Now, Native women, you know, all you ladies out there, holla. We don't want to leave you out because we have the same variation, but we call her the Pocahontas. So in this particular space, with the Pocahontas, we can see the variations, a lot of what we see around this idea of womanhood. She's very full-figured, very buxom, right? And so the tattoos creating that exoticization, the jewelry, there's bling that's always going on Pocahontas, man. She looks like she's headed up to Indian Market, right? You know, and the off the shoulder too, right? So this particular character. So what we see historically is these representations, and I always point this out because I think people don't quite understand how we get into this modern age of missing, murdered Indigenous women, is the fact that we have established a tone and tenor for Native women of being objectified for 400 years. And as much and as powerful and as much as I love to give credit to our Native actors and the folks that are doing this kind of work for Pocahontas and our models, they're doing some awesome work, you can absolutely see the difference. Look, she's got the sling over one shoulder in the historical one, same thing with the Pocahontas on the front, right? You can see these representations, you can see these images. She's got the tattoo, her hair, literally, if you go back and watch it, I used to teach it, her hair is always blowing in the wind. There is never a moment in that movie where her hair is not blowing with the colors of the wind. I'm not kidding. It was one of the things that the students and I finally recognized. Were like, dude, is her hair, like, does she have like a personal wind machine off camera the entire time? And so she's got this flowing the entire time. And what it does is it sets up, well, we have the noble savage as hyper masculinization. What we have for the women, the Pocahontas version of this is a hypersexualization and an exoticization and an eroticization. And it does, for me, very much create a direct line from where we started to where we are today. Now, some of the other research that I've done for a comic book that we created called Ghost River, which tells the history of the Conestoga Massacre in 1763, we can look at the earliest representations of Native women in colonial media. And what it basically shows, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide for this, but it shows Native women essentially as whores, right? They are enticing the Quakers to do their bidding and trade arms and armor, and they're always low cut or topless, right? So we can see these representations for Native women. This is not by accident. This is even less historical representations than we see of the Native men. What we see is this idea of this objectification. We also see this idea of motherhood, because we also have to overlay all of that with the fact that Native women were used the same way the noble savage was, to showcase to English women how to behave. Look, these Native women take care of their kids. They stay home, just like I was telling you with thunder rolling in the mountains. I want to fight. No, you have to stay home and take care of your menfolk, right? And so Native women, and we know many Native women were fierce warriors. And not only did they do all of this, but they were also stabby, right? Like, they were straight up, like, you didn't get it into their face. So we see that as well. And so as we're seeing these historical representations, this is very important. And I think that it showcases the beginning and the early interpretations of how this moves from historical representations to propagandic representations, and then what has an absolute deliberate impact and a verifiable impact within our own communities in the modern space. When you objectify people for so long, it's much easier for them to be offed, murdered, and missing. And so we see that with Native women. So I draw this all the way back. This is not a new phenomenon with Native women. So moving forward, and we'll come back to that a little bit. Moving forward, we move into the next period, which we call the last of the blank, or we call it the dying, the dying Indian. Made popular, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. There's also a very interesting dynamic that begins to occur here, which is what we call transference. And we talk about it in terms of like playing Indian, right? We set a model where the white character, our Daniel Day-Lewis Hawkeye character, begins to take all of the nativeness, right? He becomes more native than the natives. As the natives are dying out, he absorbs all of the native power, that native magic that we just saw, speaking to animals and communing with nature. He comes into this particular space, being able to do this now. And as all the natives die off, all the Americans can go forward with all of this native history. We see this today. I know Michael knows, like, we've seen some of this stuff up with the kids that are doing our traditional dances up in Southern Colorado, where they're doing, because, and literally they say this on the website, that because they are trying to save our traditions, because the native folks are going to die off, right? This is not a new phenomenon. This is what happens right here. This is how the Boy Scouts were founded 200 years later, on the same mentality that we will take all the native concepts because natives apparently were closer to nature and were amazing. And what we get into is that it's about this idea of magic and spiritualism and mysticism, rather than recognizing that native folks on this continent had built incredible civilizations, trading networks, power, diplomatic core powers, warfare. The problem is, if you walk into a space and you wipe out 90% of the population in the span of 50 years, it's going to be a lot easier to come into that space, is all we're saying, right? It's very easy to understand how a lot of this stuff gets missing. So we see this now, this idea of transference. And during this time period, this is the 1700s to the early 1800s, there are no less than 7 different plays that reference the last of the blank. There's a great book. I will show it to you here from my shelf. This book is one of the best ones that I've found. I think this will be in reverse, but if I can't show it. Native Americans as shown on stage, 1753 to 1916. Really great resource. Very hard to come by. This is one of my prized possessions. My precious. But this is where a lot of that information comes from. And it's really important to note that during this time frame, it wasn't just representational media, say political cartoons or illustrations and whatnot. It was plays, it was theater, because this is a burgeoning literate society in America. Not everybody could read, not everybody's going to the private schools and can pick this up, but plays, some were definitely for the elite, but a lot of them were for the masses. So the masses got this sense, and especially because what we know within pop culture is if it's popular once, it's going to be popular. We're going to in America, we're going to ride that train till the wheels come off. So not showing that it's just one time, there's 7 different plays. So we know that it was popular for many, many decades. And it continues to reinforce this idea that natives are dead or dying. Now, this has the impact. Now we start to see propaganda because we have a society that is expanding into the West, into these new areas and locations. But, and I will say this right now, knowing how we're all dealing with like social media and everybody kind of losing their minds because we're all inside for too long. But I tend to believe that humanity, human beings, do bend towards justice, or that they tend to understand morality, right? Because I think it's very difficult, or we know that you can do the right thing, but when you spend all your time trying to justify the wrong thing, so when you spend all your time justifying this guy, and you showcase that, like, well, they're dead and dying anyway, so it's cool if we take their land because we know we're not supposed to take their land. That's messed up, right? So we create a series of propaganda to be able to then justify that taking the land, which then influences policy. Because if you have a populace that is willing to be able to do this, then you can set policy and tone and tenor that will reinforce that and allow that populace to feel comfortable in these decisions that have been made that benefit them, but may be catastrophic to another group of humans, and especially the indigenous people that were here. So at that point, we changed the dynamic. 1824, Andrew Jackson is elected, and we know Andrew Jackson don't like no native folks up in this space. So and it's absolutely fascinating. Within this book, almost overnight, the native representations of media change like that. And they change from being this sort of noble savage or this dying Indian. It's still respectful. It still pulls the romanticism out. And they change into this new character that we term the Red Devil. We are now really moving into westward expansion. It's not just into the Shenandoah Valley anymore. It's not just into the Hudson Valley anymore. We're now trying to clear out the entire plains. This is Manifest Destiny. Jackson starts it. It goes through all of his predecessors all the way into the 1900s. When we think 1890, we think the end of the, quote, Indian Wars and Wounded Knee and the massacre, although there were still skirmishes that went on. That essentially reservationized everybody in this space. When you're fighting a war, you need a villain, right? We're seeing that in real time right now as everybody's struggling to figure out who a villain is. We can't figure out a villain, but when you want to move people into this space, you got to have a villain. This villain is epitomized by this character, Injun Joe. For those of you that had to read old Tom Sawyer back in the day, some of us do, some of us don't. When I talk to the younger kids, they ice that out of the canon for the kids having to read this these days, but a lot of us did. And for decades, a lot of us did. This is the most popular book in the mid-1800s. It sold more copies. It made the name of Mark Twain. And really what people tend to forget is because we sort of like nostalgize that it's like, oh, look at that rascal Tom, and he's whitewashing the fence, and he loves Becky and he goes to school. But the villain is Injun Joe. Injun Joe is the villain. And you can see in the linotype that went with the original book, Injun Joe, this Tom dreams, has a nightmare that Injun Joe's coming in to stab him in his sleep. Injun Joe, as the native character, ends up being killed at the end of it by being trapped and buried in a cave. And so the metaphors and the analogy that comes into play is that Mark Twain is writing about the death of the old America, the indigenous America, to be taken over by Tom, the rascally upstart America, right? White America. So that's what happens. And the fact that like that Injun Joe is buried in the cave, right? He doesn't even get like a warrior's death. He gets like a coward's death in this space. So you see, so you see that happening and taking place. And this perpetuates and permeates the entire space. This is what the Westerns are built on, a native villain, right? We have to have this villain to understand that we are at war. And if we're at war, we America, excuse me, colonial America, is at war with the indigenous people in this space who are defending their homeland, essentially. They're defending the treaties that they made in this space and getting wiped out. But it's easier for a populace to find this palatable, to swallow this, if the main character is a villain. And so we move into sort of our last, realm. And this comes in around the 1900s. We move into what we call it two terminologies: the neo-noble savage, who comes back in the 1900s, or the tragic chief. And I love it's epitomized right here, especially by Iron Eyes Cody, not native, Italian. This is Redface, right? Environmental. So what happens is, in the turn of the century, Native folks now are finally getting to go to college, right? The East Coast has definitely been colonized and assimilated. The Central Plains, kind of the same thing, and the West Coast is moving in the same direction. So this is by the turn of the century. Native folks are kind of like, listen, we're going to have to, concede or die. And so and boarding school starts. And so Native folks are accessing education. Well, as we're accessing education, we get an insight into how the mechanics of Western society work, which means we start writing. We now begin to control our own media. Morning Dove, Charles Eastman, Ohiesa, who else am I thinking? Darcy McNichol. These early Native writers begin to start putting their own stories into play. And it still fulfills the Western romanticized notion of Native folks, but it's now starting to be a little bit more on our terms. There's a little bit more nuance, and there's a little bit of the actual history and recognition. Well, America at the time starts to feel a little bit bad about the fact that they have practiced ethnicide, genocide for the last 200 years. And so Native folks begin to move their way back into the collective consciousness, both romanticized, but also heroic, and moving back into that noble savage, except there's a tragic aspect to it now. And if you look back at the early cinema, especially things like the Jim Thorpe story with Burt Lancaster, you see that it's always this sort of duality. The Native character is like, usually has a non-Native girlfriend or white girlfriend, and he has to be like, I am going to go home to my people, and I'm sorry, I love you so much, but my people are the most important, right? And I was watching these movies when I got older. I was like, dude, you can take her with you. Like, did you just want to get out of this relationship? Is that why you did this? Because that sounds to me like you got some excuses, brother. Like, you're like, I don't want her no more. I got to go find someone else. Because if we know historically, everybody welcome, just come, yeah, baby, come on in. You one of us now, right? So we know that's how it would work. But the romanticized notion of Native folks within this space, this tragic aspect. And we see this represented here because, especially as we began to move into the environmental movement in the environmental space, Native people began to be re-identified with the noble savagery of the Native aspects and where they came from, and that they were closer to nature, and that we could talk with the wind, hair blowing in the wind, that we could talk, I could touch trees. And again, highlighting the same thing that happened 400 years before, Native folks are being used as a counterpoint, not on our own merits, not with our own identity, but we are being used as a counterpoint to the ways that now greedy, dirty, terrible Americans are acting. Look, you should be acting like the noble savage who's crying as somebody throws some trash out of their car on the ground. And of course, if you know this is the crying Indian motif. We know that you've made it into pop culture sphere if it makes it onto The Simpsons. And if anybody's watched this episode, it is actually particularly hilarious. I do love this ending for that particular episode of The Simpsons, because the dude looks behind him and it's just this pile of trash, and then he just screams at the end of it. So I highly go back and look at it. It's on Disney Plus. You can check it out. There's my Disney Plus plug. I'll be expecting my check from Uncle Walt here pretty soon. So that's where we kind of end in this space. And we can really see this today. We still see this in these spaces. And I'll go back to why I'm titling that article, White Folks Love Dead Indians. The last 3 movies that came out that featured major Native characters or major Native theme were Woman Walks Ahead, Wind River, and Hostiles, right? So this is in the last 5 years. Woman walks ahead talks about the spirit of resistance, but puts a non-native woman as the main character, with Sitting Bull, and how she kind of helped him in this space. And we can talk about, like the white saviorism, we can go into that. But really what I look at is the fact that it plays off the idea of the tragic narrative. We know what happens to the Lakota folks at that point. So what we're playing is this counterpoint of making non-native people feel better about how they help native folks out. Hostiles basically is good Indians versus bad Indians. So the Red Devil versus the Noble Savage. The Noble Savage is the ones that help out the cavalry and the white folks in the army on that. And the Red Devil are the ones that try and fight against that. Again, trying to protect their own homeland because they're not conceding to colonization. They should just roll over and everything will be fine. And we see this also specifically in the representations of Native women. 50%, almost half of the books that represent Native women in children's literature represent two characters, Pocahontas and Sacagawea. And you can go check this out. Check it on Amazon, right? You'll look through the list, 50% of the women that are represented. We don't talk about Native women warriors. What we talk about is two Native women that were in service of manifest destiny, not necessarily of their own accord, but perpetuating that mythology of American, the American expansionism. So these two women represent more than anybody else. We don't see anybody about Lozin, or, you get some modern interpreter, you get some Wilma Mankiller, but you don't see any of these, you don't see War Woman of the Cherokee. You don't see any of these Native women, Lakota women that were obviously warriors within the space, because if you're in warfare, everybody be fighting, right? So that's a lot of the, that continuous perpetualization of that Native identity that factors in. And the last one, of course, with Wind River is just a whole bunch of dead Native women, right? Which is why I have seen the trailers, I've seen the reviews, but I actually have refused to watch it just out of my own thing. It's because I don't feel right watching a showcase that just highlights and spectacularizes and objectifies, once again, the fact that Native women are missing and murdered. It didn't bring anything to light in my mind. I was like, we know that there's a lot of things that are happening. It made a nice vehicle for some incredible Native actors, which I think they did a marvelous job. And I always have to separate that out, as we can critique things. We don't have to cancel everybody as part of those things, right? Like we're in this space that it's like, I can critique Wind River without having to say that the person that was a part of it sold out or did whatever. I was like, no, I want you to have a job. You're a Native actor. But I can also say that I don't think that really helps the cause. I like to see live Native women being badasses, I want to see a Native woman with a war club, going at it, stabby in the middle of the night, so that we don't underestimate them, right? So in most of that, we see these representations of Native people coming into these spaces, and we can see this out throughout comic books. I love pointing out some of the titles: White Indian, Straight Arrow. This is the comic book representation of this. A couple of them you can't see under there. Scalp Hunter is a Native character from this from the 50s in this space. And one thing I forgot to point out is in the 50s, one of the other things is that we start to forget, because the nostalgia goggles go on, is a lot of these things that we sort of half remember. Davy Crockett. Anybody all watch the Disney Davy Crockett? I think everybody forgets the subtitle. Davy Crockett, Indian Fighter, is the subtitle of the character. It was the most popular television show in the 1950s. It was watched by a third of the population of the United States, right? Of people that had television. So this is how we get here, right? And this is the part that when we talk about why Native folks are constantly pushing back against this stuff, but even our own folks, I tend to believe, don't have a full understanding of how deep the history goes. I think a lot of incredible work has come out around the media representations, film and television. Real Indians, fantastic documentary. I highly recommend it. REEL, Indians. But I don't think that it goes deep enough to understand that this has been jammed into the American psyche for 400 years, and then subsequently jammed into our own psyche. As Native folks and the existences that we have, we also perpetuate a lot of these dynamics. We come into these spaces thinking that, that we're not quite aware of how we have existed in response to this or subsumed by this. Now, why do I point that out? The reason why the dead and dying Indian thing is so hard for me, and why I do clickbait, and why I come at people on it definitely, is because working with Native young people for so many years, what I've seen is if you continue, and I did this, and I know this because I did a lot of gang work as well with non-Native communities. They did a study years ago, I want to say 20 years ago. I don't know if they followed up recently, but they did a study with gang members in South Central in Los Angeles. And one of the things that they found in that time is the kids that were going through these schools didn't believe they had a future. It was a nihilism that existed, right? And so what it did was perpetuate the risky behavior. If I don't feel that I got a future after 18, I'm dead anyway, or I'm in prison, right? So might as well live now. It's the worst YOLO, because it's like, you only live once, but it's like you only live once with a very, very tragic, terrifying future, one of nothingness. And that's what they see within their daily lives. We see that within our res-based communities, we see that within our urban-based communities, but then we also have this overlay of the propaganda that tells us that Native folks ceased to exist in 1890. There's the erasure. Dead and dying Indians, continuing to showcase that, continuing to show that in the media, then inflicts and influences the psyche of my kiddos, and the kiddos that I used to teach all the time. So if they believe that they are dead and dying and they have no future, what do they got to live for, right? So a lot of the work we've been trying to do is really about indigenous futurisms and like showcasing all of this, but this is where it comes from, right? This is the start, and this is how it is sunk into the consciousness, and how we're so very unaware. It's why I am a scholar of pop culture, because I think pop culture permeates our brains in ways that we don't understand. You got kids wearing Spider-Man shirts. They don't even see who Spider-Man is, but it's everywhere because it goes along with the marketing, the capitalization, the economics, and that also plays out in terms of Native identity. So going back to my original premise, when we look at what's happening currently now with the virus and the pandemic, and you see articles in the New York Times that are like, oh, look at the sad and tragic Indians. Look at how they're dying. All I can see is, yeah, and you guys are just continuing the line that it's okay. One, you haven't done anything about our communities, even though we've asked, we've begged. All you want is to fulfill your narrative so that you feel good, bad, or whatever, satisfied, about our identity and existence. I'm much more interested in stories of resilience. I'm much more interested in stories of Native folks taking care of their families and their communities. And I'm much more interested in showcasing, how we, not only did we survive in the face of terrifying, truly a Walking Dead type of thing, right? Like we are the ones that survived the apocalypse to begin with. But how we have continued to hold to our cultures and our communities and take care of everybody, even in the face of all of that. And how right now, currently, we're rebuilding our own media and our own understandings so that we can begin to tell our own stories in a way that allows our future generations, our young people, to take spirit, to take heart, and showcase how awesome they are. I'm going to flip through these real quick. You can just see some really cool stuff. And then I want to just leave a little bit of time if we have a little bit of time for questions. But this is just some of the media that's coming out right now. Video games, role-playing games, science fiction and fantasy, fashion, futurisms, right? Like this is crazy, weird, and awesome, right? This is Virgil Ortiz. This is his Pueblo interpretation of what it lks like in the Pueblo Revolt hundreds of years from now. But there's our stop. I'll flip back on that. But I don't know if you want to unmute. We want to ask questions. I don't know how it works. You can raise the hands. I have no idea how technology works anymore in this day and age.
As we have this conversation about technology, I had to unmute myself so that we can actually have this conversation. But one of the things, I'm glad that you showed a little bit of the movies and the popular culture that has influenced. And thank you for bringing up Mia. That's my great grandfather, Patrick Desjardins, and
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
yeah, and that's one of the things that we've been talking about for decades is that that's not a person who's pretending to be native. I always used to bring up the whole, it's not my fault my great grandfather had, those types of women around him when it comes to being up in Red Lake. But, as you mentioned, she's now one of our missing and murdered Indigenous women because she's gone.
She's gone.
Kind of the
And
whole.
she's gone without, I will say, I appreciate what they did, but I will say that for me, the big flaw was that they didn't do anything to address it, right?
Yeah.
It was just one day she was there, next day she was gone. And it was this kind of pushback against, like, I guess PC culture, whatever you want to put at that, but it was just like, it was there. And I will say social media is the Wild West right now. But I had an elder that I very much respect, who's done a lot of work against mascots and imagery. And I was like, let's not forget that we don't want to also erase the Native folks that were doing this work. And they just had none of it. They were not having it. And I was like, I need to take a little break for a little while, right? Because I was just like, you're perpetuating the same thing that we run into when we say, please don't erase Native folks, but you're willing to erase Native existence and Native identity without recognizing the history and the story. And I think that's what the colonizers done. So
I changed my background to what it is in my office because I have
it's nice.
my print of my great grandfather's fancy dancer in the background.
That's it. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, and again, these are the things that we often talk about in our families. We have these double-sided histories when it comes to that traditional side plus the side that people had to do to live, to survive in our economies when it comes to, like you mentioned, the boarding school. There were those who may not have been welcomely accepted back in their home communities because they were riding that line of, kind of we have with our students now when they go back home. It's, well, who are you? We don't remember you. Where have you been? You haven't been at village meeting. We don't understand, why are you talking to us this way? We have this conversation when it comes to students and how they go through the changing and shifting of identities when it comes to code switching. You may be able to talk like we talk about, concepts and theories in the classroom and on the university campus, but when you bring that up back home, sometimes that's that shift that you get.
Yep.
But kind of like what you were talking about as well, the erasure of people, utilizing, Tommy Orange when it comes to his book of Native people trying to find a way to learn how to be Native who are urban Native American or half Native American, tribal members. I'm going off of a email question that we had gotten. It's and combining it with a little bit of my own. How do we help out when it comes to those who have to look towards popular culture to gain a little bit of an understanding of where they might be coming from, or who might be utilizing that as a mechanism to propel themselves and find an identity?
Right. And how are they gravitating toward what they see as representational that they don't know necessarily any difference about, right? Like it's a lot of the stuff where, the easy point out is to point out mascots, right? And Native folks that identify with, some of the more stereotypical mascots. I was one of those kids. I'll fully admit it. Growing up, I was a Atlanta fan. I was a Washington football fan. So because for me, trying to find my identity in a world where I'm not represented at all, right? And I grew up on the East Coast and West Coast, right? So we went to powwows, but my schools were not Native at all until I got back home here and I started teaching. So for me, gravitating towards that, because that was an identity marker for me. I was like, that's Native, right? I got my Native on. And we know it's really detrimental. And, as we unpack all the problems with the mascots, but that's what we run into. And then how do we look at, that's why, partly what I try to say, in terms of the, the representational stuff is like, I don't begrudge folks that got to get a job. I don't begrudge folks that necessarily as Native folks, because I don't punch across for Native folks. Like if you like that particular mascot, cool. My job is to try and find better things for you. Like I got to find better representation. Because if you've got no other representation to go with, that's what you're going to gravitate towards. That's the erasure part. So for me, that's always been the big thing. I tend not to try. I was like, yeah, all my brothers and sisters that are fighting to try and get that stuff removed, I'm always going to support them. But I'm also saying, and we got to find a way for our folks to have a graceful, exit strategy, right? Like some of our folks that have bought into that, because that's part of their identity. And if we eliminate that, then you're like screwing over their identity as well with this, right? For better, for worse. Again, we're not getting into that part of it. We can debate that, but it is an identity marker. And so if it's an identity marker and you say, gone, what just happened? Now my identity has completely shifted because I don't know what I'm supposed to identify with anymore. And we see that very often when there's nothing there. We all know we identify with probably whatever's handy, right? So we have a lot of folks that identify with mascots and whatnot. And then we also have, folks that are just like, well, find better things. I was like, listen, I love Last of the Mohicans. That's my guilty pleasure. I think that movie's great. Man, he throws the war club, and like the native guys are totally badass in that. So that was an identifying piece for me, right? Because I was looking for native heroes. I was actually not a fan of Dances with Wolves, right? I liked there were native actors in it, and I thought that was cool. But I was just like, it didn't appeal to me anyway. I wanted superheroes, right? So I loved Predator because it had Billy Soul, had our native guy in there, right? And an awesome native guy, and like deconstructing it. I love deconstructing it around my identity because I was just like, he's the only guy that recognized the danger, and he recognized it because of traditional stories from his people, and he's the last guy standing next to the white guy. Now we can get into the whole idea of transference and all the rest, but I was just like, best native character, possibly it like definitely in the 80s, and possibly even into the 90s for any type of representation. So.
Nice. And also with that, when it comes to the representation, we know that we have quite a bit of students who, like you mentioned, are part native when it comes
Right.
to their blood quantum, where they come from. And we know we have students who are outwardly African-American looking, outwardly Hispanic looking, outwardly, who will try and go into those identities to try and find a sense of, well, where do I fit? Because popular culture doesn't have a native like me because I'm not as brown, or I'm not as red, or I'm not as long haired, or type of a thing. But also in that, sometimes they have that tiredness of having to try to explain why
Right.
they're native or how they're native.
Right. The
And,
how. Yep.
and how have you seen that when it comes to the shift in popular culture to look at the natives that are not just the brown skinned natives, but also the light complected, blue eyes, green eyes, Micmac, or Mekasuki, or those East Coast natives that really don't have the dark brown skin that many
Right.
have been popularized as.
We, not as much, right? Like, I mean, so I try to keep my pulses, on a lot of, and I know there's a ton of native films that come out, so forgive me. I'm sure there's all sorts of great representations, but the things that percolate to the surface that finally kind of make it toward me often tend to, if it's a non-native, they often tend to still kind of revolve around, res-based versus urban-based identities. So actually that's been the shift, because we're really looking at like res and urban, like the res versus the urban type of thing, right? I think it's been fascinating or really exciting to see a lot of the shifts in the genre stuff that's starting to come out, right? Like, so the horror has been really fantastic. Urban native kids, right, that are all kind of like grouping together, and then they all like, there's a killer, right? Like that stuff has been great. Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum, right? It's now getting released on streaming up in Canada. I'm so excited if it'll get released here, but I've loved Barnaby's work when he did, Rivalry on Ghouls too, hard hitting, urban-y, suburban. I mean, it's kind of res based, but it's also kind of urban based, concepts. And, now it's zombie flicks. So I think what we're seeing really is, I don't know how many folks, and I would open this up to anybody, and I should probably like post about it, of like, folks that are looking at talking about identity, and native filmmakers, native comic book folks that are really diving into that kind of stuff. I haven't seen it as much. I think, you know, where I've put my time in is not talk, and I'll say this, not talking necessarily about the identity part, right? Like I haven't been talking about the identity part, although I tend to like have my characters a little more mixed. So, you know, I wrote the comic book Six Killer, Alice in Wonderland meets Kill Bill, set in Cherokee country, revolves all around, you know, the Osage murders and the whole sort of like all sorts of, you know, it's kind of like Watchmen. There's all sorts of machinations that happened before our main character got in there. But I don't dive into like how native, you know, the character is, right? It's part of their existence. And they're, you know, the character is mixed, at least the way I write it. But I'm not having those conversations. I haven't seen a lot of folks that are really having those conversations, for better or for worse. I don't know if it's a flaw. I mean, as you say it, I'm kind of like, I should write that. I'll do Love and Rockets, native style, right? You know,
Awesome.
Dale DeForest already did that. I'll have to do something else.
So when it comes to, we were talking about, so I'm reading the chat.
Yeah.
Did you want to go ahead and say something, Claudia?
Sure, thank you. I was just wondering, thank you for the presentation, first of all, and sorry I kept on going back and forth. It's just this
Okay.
screen where I have the camera is like this big, and this one is
That's
where
right.
it's bigger, so I have to keep on
Understandable.
switching. So one of the questions we have, Monita, also is, we created a website as an offset of the IRD to make it easier for certain tribal communities or tribal members to learn about different news, but we made sure that when the news were put there, that there is always the perspective of the tribal leader or the Secretary of Indian Affairs, or, you know, that part. But we, besides Santa Clara, actually, because we have an interview with, a piece of an interview with the governor, we don't have any other story, right?
Yeah.
And part of what I don't know how to get them, first of all, besides highlighting some aspects in those parts of the news. And the other side is, how do we balance the need for many of the communities, right, to say, hey, we have done wrong for many years, and that's part of why we haven't been able to respond in the same ways as cities or things like that. But at the same time, it's not because we are the hopeless, and as you call it, right? I really like that. I have pages and pages of notes of what
Awesome, thank you.
You said, but it's really like different pieces of the, you know, the tragedy of the Native existence. But I understood it not in the sense of we have done wrong, and that's why you are facing bigger tragedy than other groups, but because you are the tragedy, and I wish that wasn't the case, kind of thing, you know? So how do we balance the yes, these are amazing people who are doing amazing things with the little resources in different communities in different ways, and then also not deleting the hey, they have been done wrong, and that's why the challenges are even worse.
I think you hit it right there. I think it's not that we don't call attention to tragic things that have happened, right? It's not that we don't call attention to historical inequities, ethnocide, genocide. We don't wipe that under the rug. What happens with a lot of the writing that goes on is that it fetishizes the tragedy. It revels in the tragedy. It wallows in that tragedy because you're trying to evoke an emotional response. Now, again, that could be for good or for bad. I tend to believe that it, and I'll just say this for me, I tend to believe it's bad because right now we're facing something, you know, unprecedented since the long walk, at least within the Navajo community, right? Like the stuff that we're facing. And if we're utilizing it for that purpose, but then I think the long-lasting impacts can also be just as disastrous, right? If we continue to fetishize the tragedy beyond this, then we still engage in the fact that, like, oh, look at the Navajo sheep herders, and we know all the kids that are down there. right? Yeah, some of their families are sheep herders. Some of their families are engineers. Some of their families are rocket scientists. And some of these kids are going to be rocket scientists, right? So I think really where it lies is in terms of like the reporting or the writing that comes with it is to try and find the folks that are going, the balance comes in really, for me, it's about heroes, right? Interview the doctors that are out there that are doing this day to day, right? Like talk to those folks, talk to the kids that are doing futurisms and figuring out how to like do, you know, on the spot testing, you know, statistical analysis, like showcasing. What I always say is like, I say, be brave, be bold, be brilliant, right? That's my mantra, right? So it's like, be brave, go ahead and do this, be bold, because you have to step out. And I know it's so antithetical to the ways we're supposed to exist, but bold doesn't necessarily mean you got to call attention to yourself. Being bold means that you're being powerful. And then being brilliant is that we've been brilliant for thousands of years. Our folks are the ones that built Chaco Canyon, right? Like we carved a civilization into the side of a mountain. So anytime we can remind that's the other balance is for me, anytime we can remind our folks and my people at home that we did this, that we will make it through. And if we're smart, because we are smart, then we are going to come out on the other side better than everybody else, better than we ever were. And I try not to, like, my balance is more trying not to be like Pollyanna about it, you know, coming in and being all just like, look, it's all fine, everybody, because it's not fine. We know that there's stuff that happened. We know there's tragedies. I write about, you know, this stuff all the time. The 1763 massacre of the Conestoga ended the Susquehanna people. The Conestoga disappeared off the face of the earth. But the way I wrote that particular comic and the way that we worked with people was to showcase that, you know what, these are people that didn't die in a tragic fetishization. They died on their feet. They sang before they died. So the last images, and then always showcasing like living Native folks, right? So every comic I write, no matter if it's a tragic thing, if we're talking about like, you know, the reconquest of Pueblo lands, you know, after the rebellion, if we're talking about the decimation of a people, my last image is always Native people standing up, face forward, smiling, nods, but like the last image you're going to see is living Native folks. That's the balance, right? The balance, the fetishization of tragedy comes in when we want to mire in the death cult, when we want to, you know, again, wallow around in how sad the aspect is, rather than showcasing and coming back to saying how we will make it through this. We've done it before. We'll be smart. Doesn't mean that like we can be reckless, right? That's the other part. We put out all these posters. I don't know if you saw any of the propaganda posters we put out, but all these posters, I think the one we put out is like, resilience means common sense. That was one of the terms that I put for that. It was like, resilience means common sense. Don't come into thinking that you're going to be able to, like, you know, just punch C-19 in the face. Hey, we survived an apocalypse already. I mean, I got all these kids, right? Because they're all 20 and they're all immortal. You know, as we know, it doesn't matter, right? So you're like, they're all gonna come in and be like, man, I'll just lick toilets. I'm gonna do whatever. My people lasted through this, and they're all like thinking they're badass. And I was like, that our people survived because of common sense, and 90% of our population didn't survive. So, and they didn't survive for a number of reasons: targeted genocide, targeted biological warfare, the fact that these types of diseases prey upon the fact, you know, prey upon the heart and spirit of people. You go to comfort people that are dying, and then you catch that. So it's actually, I was looking and say, I was like, the reason why our folks died was because we love our folks so much. We took care of them and that was more heartrending than the actual disease than smallpox could have done, was that we actually had to learn to be more like the colonizer. Because smallpox decimated those populations in England as well. And what those folks used to do was just put boards and they lock people in and they would let them die, right? And so we finally had to learn that lesson. And I think that is the most heart-wrenching lesson that our folks had to learn, is that we got to do this. It's 200 years later. We can use our brains. We can figure out how to make sure grandma and grandpa aren't hurt. That's what I mean when I say, like, we don't fetishize the tragedy. We call it out. We call out colonization. We call out ethnocide, genocide. We call out historical, you know, massacres, but we don't wallow in it, because that's where it becomes the issue for me.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have any other questions that they wanted to bring up?
There's all your info. Woo. I like to use my hands a lot, even on video.
I just wanted to comment on that part that the last part you discussed of some of the young people saying, "Hey, I won't wear gloves, I won't wear mask, I'll go out." You know, we had some that had actually been very close to our program, because of that, precisely how you express it, because we have lived other tragedies, and this is not, new to us, and kind of that attitude. And it took me to a place that I didn't know what to say, because I didn't see it that way, but I am not native from here, at least. So then I just didn't know how to tackle that. And I just thought, well, there were several things that we have learned through history that Native people in this area at least did to protect themselves from many things. And that's why they were able to be resilient and survive even in small, groups of people, but not because they went and exposed themselves willingly. So I appreciate that, because I didn't know how to answer to that.
Yeah. I think it comes back as, for me, we put it on the propaganda is resilience, means common sense, first and foremost. Like, your people weren't dumb. Your ancestors didn't survive so that you could go out and, showcase how awesome a warrior you were against a germ. I mean, I would say this is not like Counting Coup. This is not like you can fight your way out of this. This is invisible stuff. It doesn't matter. You could be the strongest warrior. You catch this, you could die, right? And I think the other part is trying to focus so much on our grandmas and grandpas, right? Like, dude, that's cool. You can be awesome, but you know what it means to be a warrior? It means you take care of your grandmas and grandpas, because they're the ones. We had this crazy conversation, because like the day New Mexico shut down, like the day the schools were shutting down, I think it was Friday, like the 14th of March. I was actually up in Los Alamos, at Los Alamos High School, doing a presentation, knocking on whatever. I was like, all right, none of you all you kids, you stay away from me, because y'all are germ infested. I don't trust any of you. And they like broadcast me, and the kids were like 6 feet away. But I was talking with a couple of the Native kids, and they were asking me like, questions, because this was now starting to really be on their mind, right? Because school's closing. And I said, one of the things that you all have to talk about is, put it like this. Maybe it's not even just grandmas and grandpas, but when you're talking about being a warrior, and you're talking about this, and you're also talking about your language and your culture and your language, these are the last speakers of your language. You need to protect your culture and your language, because grandmas and grandpas, not just as a personal thing, just keeping our grandmas and grandpas, these are the ones that are the last connections, right? I know, Michael, when we talked about this, there were some issues in some of our villages where some of the folks died out, right? And so they were some of the keepers. They were some of the tradition keepers. So our folks were having to try and scramble. Imagine that happens. We're seeing it happen in Navajo. Imagine that happens in a small population where 1% of the population, 2% of the population catches this and dies. And that's our grandmas and grandpas, and they're our tradition keepers. So I tend to push back a little bit harder against those kiddos, being like, you talk a good game about being like warrior and culture, and culture means you protect the culture. Culture means you take care of your grandmas and grandpas. It doesn't mean how badass you can be. That's where the sacrifice is. So that's what I come back with them at. And I tend to be a little bit, I'll be a little harder, on them on that, because I'm just like, listen, don't play around. I mean, I'm indoors right now. We're all indoors. We know a bunch of people want to go outside right now, and that's cool. We all want to go outside, and some of us take our chances. I got to go grocery shopping. I got to do a little bit here and there, and I'm just like crossing my fingers. But you don't got to invite it, right? Yeah, gloves, mask. We got our cool. I got my Star Wars mask. I'm good to go. But there's a difference between, not being afraid and inviting, inviting it in, right? Like, you can not be afraid against the colonizer, but you don't have to be all just like, well, here's the keys. Like that's two different things, right? So that's kind of where I try to level with the kiddos as much as possible. I mean, I didn't do it as much since I was, but I have folks in my social feed. That's why I made the posters I did. I was like, you got to do this for your grandparents. Quit thinking you're a badass, because being a badass means you take care of your grandparents, means you take care of the elders in the community. They are your wisdom keepers. And if they're gone, you don't have an identity. You have, and I will say this with all respect, you have a pop culture identity. You have an identity where these kids come in and say that, like, this is what pop culture has told me it means to be a Native male or Native female, badass, you know, ready to tussle, fight, because that's my warrior spirit pride. Man, being a warrior means you take care of your homeland. That's what you do, in my mind.
This is where we get a little bit of this role changing now, that as we get older, we need to take that.
Yep.
You know, when we were young guys, you know, running around in the plaza and, you know, just having like a heyday, a feast, you know, it was this, oh yeah, I get to do this, I get to do that. And, oh, you guys keep telling me not to do these things. And now we have to be that person that has to tell people to do these things.
Don't do that.
But there's one question that we had in the chat, and it was, if you can include one book, you know, you showed your precious, you know,
just one book,
either one or two books that you would want to include in like an ethnic studies course that talks about not necessarily the poverty porn that we've been seeing when it comes to a lot of the books, but something that really stands out, that shows a little bit about the story, not necessarily in that tragic way, but maybe in a, you know, a strengths-based way.
Yeah.
Is that book in existence? Because that's always the other question. In
different ways. I mean, so, you know, I think there's a really great, I mean, I'll say it's hard to choose. It's like it's like there is so much great stuff that's written by Native folks in this space. As a general understanding of some things, I think, what is it, Dr. Estes's most recent book, the one he did about Standing Rock, and the title eludes me right now. I think it all has a great historical perspective. I think it's a fantastic book. I would say that one, there's a bit of a caution because it does, like, I mean, he's Northern, right? So he's Lakota, you know, and so it's like saying, like, his representation of his own people, do we apply that to all the Native folks? And then does that just perpetuate what we see around Native identity? From my perspective, if we were going to do one ethnic studies at NMSU, I would say anything but, like, and I got that up here. Where is it? Yeah, Dr. Joe's book, Joe Sando, Pueblo People, still one of my this is one of my original copies. This one stays on the shelf. I don't even sell this, and this one don't go to the shop at all, right? So, and well thumbed through. Look at my little paper clips up in there, right? So I would say that this is one of them, because I think he breaks it down from an academic standpoint as well as an ethnographic and an insider standpoint. One of the things that I remember teaching my kids, because I used to teach off of this book as an ethnic studies book, but just for my Pueblo kids, was telling them about, like, the whole concept of our governors and our own, you know, our own village leaders and our religious leaders, and then our governor leaders. And he calls it straight up. He's like, governors were always to deal with the white folks, and our folks, our internal village folks, those were to deal with the internal stuff, right? And so when we get into our own conversations about kind of power and control, who's calling the shots for wherever, and I think these are really deep questions. I always go back. I was like, listen, Dr. Joe, baby, you know, for me, a superhero, because he doesn't mince words. He talks about the identity. He talks about what it means to be Pueblo. He doesn't shy away from what it looks like in New Mexico. He calls out the colonizer, right? He calls out, is like, no, this was torture. You know, the Spanish were torturing our folks, right? I'd rather see this taught than most of the stuff that they put into the K-12 system, right? So if I was to pick one book from my Pueblo standpoint, I would say this. From my historic standpoint, philosophical standpoint, always going to pick, I would say actually the Bind Deloria Reader. Bind Deloria and Dr. Dan Wildcat. I think it's a magnificent understanding of identity, of, you know, ethnography, philosophy, indigeneity. It was profoundly impactful for all of us in education, right? I mean, if you look at any Native dissertation that's ever been written, there's always a Bind Deloria reference, because he's always in all our bibliographies, because I think the work was so impactful. He was the first guy to really illuminate the philosophical constructs. And so if we're thinking about how Native philosophy works, and I think even more so because he comes at it from from the perspective that indigenous philosophy is not a binary. And we've started to fall into more and more binaries that to be native means you have to be this. And he always said in any of the books, he says, like, these are some traits, but the idea of indigeneity is constantly evolving, because we're still trying to figure out what it means to not be, to be affected by colonization. And so a lot of our responses are always in relation to colonization and what colonialism means. So, I mean, I picked those. Those are probably, if I have to pick just one or maybe two.
Awesome. And then one of the things that we also have brought up when it comes to the chat was, can you provide a little bit more comments on Ghost River?
Oh yeah, sure. So Ghost River, just check it out. Red Planet Books and Comics, right up on the main page. We got a digital version that you can download from ghostriver.org, and we're all in digital these days. So go do it. It's free over there at ghostriver.org. It started out as a project from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the oldest library in the world, or in the United States, founded by Ben Franklin himself. Maestro Franklin, right? And they came out to us, the director of scholarly innovation, a fellow by the name of Dr. William Fenton, came out to the Comic-Con, Indigenous Comic-Con, a couple of years ago, says, I got this project. I want to meet some illustrators because I want to make sure that it is native created and native authentic. And he's like, we like native realities, we'd like you to publish it, and I want to find a native illustrator and a writer. So the native illustrator ended up getting selected was Wishoyo Alvitre. She's Tongva out of Southern California, Ventura, California. And she recommended me, which I had already worked with her on Six Killer. So our style is pretty well gelled. We knew what we were doing. And we put together this book that chronicles the story of the 1763 Conestoga Massacre, where a number of, we'll say, frontiers folks, I'd say they're the progenitors of the alt-right, got really mad that Native folks were fighting back, and that their government wasn't supporting them, the Quaker government out of Philadelphia. And so they were incited to violence by a number of their townsfolks and clergy. And rather than fighting the Native folks on their own, on the terms like warriors would do, they turned back inland to march on Philadelphia because they were cowards, and they massacred the Conestoga folks over the course of about 2 weeks. They killed about 6 of them in their home village in the Conestoga Indian Township, which is just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then 2 weeks later, 2 days after Christmas, they returned to Lancaster, where the people had been taken to the workhouse, the prison, for their safety, the remaining 14. And they told the town governors to step aside, and they came in and they slaughtered the remaining 14. And that was the end of the people that termed themselves, or that we know of as the Susquehannock, also the Conestoga. We don't know what their traditional name was for themselves. There's no record of it. So that was really, like, in some of the research and the work that we were doing, I always try to make sure that people reference themselves by their own home names, but we have no record of what they called themselves. Susquehannock is a lot like Anasazi. It was a term that I think the Lenape used, or the Seneca used, meaning enemy, essentially. It's the same thing, but it's the only representation we have of the people. A lot of the kin, so this doesn't, like, the term of the Susquehannock and the Conestoga, those folks ceased to exist in that home township. But a lot of their people migrated. So their ancestors, that blood still exists. A lot of them moved with the Lenape, and many of them moved up north with the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee and some of their other folks up in that direction. So we know that there are ancestors, in the space that continue to be there. And we went out to Philly and Lancaster, and we met with a wonderful group called Circle Legacy, which is the group of Native folks outside of Lancaster. And we put together this story to do them honor, and we asked to do honor, right? Like we made sure we did it right? We got so many folks that like to write stories. I was like, these ain't my people, so I got to go out there and ask for the blessings of these people before I start to write their story. And so we did, right? And so we wrote this story, tells the story of the Conestoga, also tells the story of the Moravian Lenape. So Lenape folks that were also taken into Philadelphia. It's the only time in American history that Quakers took up arms. They took up arms to protect the Native folks, the Christian natives, the Moravian Lenape at that space. against this mob that was coming in after they killed the Conestoga folks. They were marching on Philadelphia. And then there's all sorts of stuff that goes on with that. There's a pamphlet war. There's, you know, accusations back and forth. And what it essentially does is, you know, the Native folks were really just kind of props historically between these warring groups of the Quakers and the frontiers folks. So we wanted to give them their own voice because they don't have their story. So we wrote that story. It's been really popular. I was supposed to be out in Philly last month, like this month, because it was the closing of they had a big exhibit that was going on. So I did some zooming out for there. I was like, man, I've been in Philly so often. Hopefully when this clears, I'm gonna get back out there because we still want to present out of Lancaster. We haven't had the chance to do that yet. So we'll keep some wheels on this, but yeah, that's Ghost River.
Awesome. And, you know, next time when you're Philly, I'll make sure and let my student services mom over at Penn, over at the GIC, the Greenfield Intercultural Center, know, and maybe we can set something up where you can talk to their natives at Penn group over there.
Guy froze. Oh, my internet went out. Oh, there you're back. Okay,
no, we're
cool.
good. Yeah. But
okay,
no, good. I was just talking about, you know, maybe when next time you're in Philadelphia, I can let my student services mom over at Penn know, because I was a part of the natives at Penn, but back when we used to call it Six Directions at Penn. And
yeah.
So this is one of those things where, again, it's the networking, the communications, the connecting dots of helping out others, individuals, talk about getting that word out. But definitely, you know, is there any other questions that anybody else have? Because I can definitely ask a ton of questions, but I also want to make sure that I can share this space because, you know, again, these are those types of things that we wanted to talk about when it comes to getting beyond, you know, some of the stories that we see and getting the, you know, having these types of conversations. Because sometimes these kind of conversations can't happen in a classroom because there's always that, again, well, I was always told, or, you know, my family always knows this, or, you know, the various ways that we understand and get the knowledge that we receive, you know, kind of like you mentioned when it comes to the generalization of Native American epistemology, of, you know, sometimes it's various ways that we learn things. You know, sometimes we learn things by others observing us and letting us know that, okay, now we see this trait in you, you're ready to go on to this next experience. You're ready to go on to the next area, as opposed to the Western education mindset that's, we're going to throw everything at you. If it doesn't collect, it doesn't pull, if it doesn't stick, it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it creates this, I mean, it is the binary, right? The whole point is that, like, throughout our history, we know is about scaffolding. You know, you would move to that next space when you could demonstrate that you had the skill and capacity to be able to get to that next space. But there was no judgment if you didn't. It was just where you were. That's the other part, right? There's such a judgment within the academy, which is such a Western mentality. It's like, oh, you don't know that? Well, you're a dummy. It's like, yo, I mean, maybe not. Maybe I got all sorts of other skills. I got all sorts of other gifts. But it comes at it from this perspective that if you don't know that, or you don't get that, then, you know, you're, you know, like, you don't know what you're doing. And that's not indigenous methodology, right? That epistemology, the way that we come at it is like, listen, everybody's got a space in the community. We don't know what that space is going to be. You don't know what that space is going to be. We're just here to make sure that you have a good heart and a good spirit, and that you're going to cycle back and do that work in the community, right? And that's who you take care of. You know, I mean, like, I've been working at Laguna on and off whenever I'm called, you know, and whenever I get out there for 20 years now, since I've been an adult. My dad said, come home and teach. I was like, all right, what else? I'm going to, you know, I was like, okay. And I went home and taught at LA. And I go off and I get my grad degree, and I'm still working out there. I work out at Acoma with the school system. You know, I'm doing evaluation work. I'm trying to figure out how to get supplies out to the kids right now. Like, we're trying to get some stuff out to the kiddos that don't have internet access, of like, here's some coloring pages, here's a crossword puzzle, like, do something, right? Like, because some of these kids ain't going to be able to get online and do the fun Zoom and all the stuff that my kid has, because I live in Albuquerque, right? And our kids at Pewaukee don't, because they ain't got no internet. So we're trying to figure out that. That's the scaffolding, right? That's how it works.
Definitely. Yeah. And again, it's also, where do we meet when it comes to, we know we can provide on the campus, we know we can create the environments, but I know for us at New Mexico State University, we're a land grant institution, and, you know, we're not really looking at this of, you know, now we're in people's homes. And sometimes we're
Right.
not even at their home. We're at their post office waiting for them to be
Right.
picked up, type of a thing. And how do we make sure that we talk about and look at this digital inequity that we have going on when
Digital
it comes to the
inequity.
infrastructure that we have, and
Yep.
how can we amend our curriculum to meet the needs and to meet where people are at, as opposed to where we would want them at.
Yep.
So,
yeah, absolutely. That's going to be the question coming in, because we're faced it now. So we got to figure it out.
Definitely. And thank you very much for sharing your time with us as we get to, 6 minutes over. Yep.
Yeah. We did pretty good. We did pretty good. So,
but thank you very much again for being with us. And we just want to talk about, again, Dr. Sando's book. We have them in our library. I know that's something I looked at when it comes to my time at Penn and, my research on the evolution of marumas and how they come to be now from what they were way back when. And this is one of those things where, sometimes we go elsewhere to learn some of our own culture, but because, again, we weren't ready to hear it when we were talked about it, when we were told it in these specific areas. Yeah. Thank you for, again, coming on and talking with us.
Thank you all.
I definitely want to get you down in Las Cruces to have this conversation.
We'll get there soon. I know. We're going to figure it out once all this stuff gets a little bit more squared away, right? And we can take care of our folks and make sure that everybody is safe. So, but yeah, I'm always at your disposal for all you guys. Anything else, always hit me up. I'm sure you can post out, to folks, just WordCraft Circle at wordcraft.director@gmail.com. The email, so you can just send me on with that. If you got any writing that you all want to take a look at, there's mentorship. Like, we're relaunching our sites and getting everything consolidated around how we support native writers, storytellers, and creatives. So all this work factors into that. So, anybody that needs any support, we can certainly help. We got lots of networking and folks to be able to support native folks coming through and the kiddos.